Good afternoon, and welcome. My name is David Fott. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Great Works Academic Certificate Program at UNLV. The Great Works Academic Certificate Program exists to encourage undergraduates to spend as much time as they can with the greatest minds who have ever lived, from Karl Marx on the left to Edmund Burke on the right. And those are just the political minds. Then there are those in literature, science, and religion. The program requires 12 credits of courses featuring primary sources by authors on our 9-page list, which is available on the website of the Great Works program. It's a way to certify that you've taken rigorous courses and to impress graduate schools and employers. I won't say more about the program now, but feel free to contact me, especially by email in these pandemic days. Funding for today's lecture has come from the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History, an organization based in Pennsylvania that has among its programs a Constitution Day initiative. We're here today because of Constitution Day, a couple of days early, the day established by the U.S. Congress for celebrating the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787. Our speaker today, Russell Muirhead, is the Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics and Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. He's co-director of the Political Economy Project there. He's author of the books Just Work, published by Harvard University Press in 2004, and the book The Promise of Party in a Polarized Age, published by Harvard University Press in 2014. He's the co-author of the book A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy, published by Princeton University Press in 2019. He's also written many articles on ideas and institutions in U.S. constitutional democracy. He serves as a member of the New Hampshire House of Representatives. Professor Muirhead received his bachelor's and doctoral degrees from Harvard University and a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Balliol College of Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. His topic for today is, can partisan representatives make a nonpartisan constitution work? If you have questions arising during the lecture, please type them into the chat feature, and I will relay them to Professor Muirhead after his talk. And as I think you have heard, just as a note, this lecture is being recorded. So, without further ado, Professor Muirhead, welcome.
Well, gosh, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Fott. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to be giving the Constitution Day lecture to you. And thanks to the Jack Miller Center for keeping this cause alive, for keeping the day in people's view, and for making it work at universities, at your university and universities all over the country. I like, listening to the Constitution Day lecture that we have here every year, and I feel like I learn a lot from it. And so it's a humbling and daunting task to try to give one. And I welcome it though, and I'm honored by the opportunity. So thank you very much. And today I would like to talk about the Constitution and our parties, or the Constitution and the parties. And in particular, this question, can partisan representatives make a nonpartisan constitution work? I think when we first hear that question, the intuitive take on it is that we have hyper-partisan, very ideological, very uncompromising representatives who are bringing a separation of powers constitution to its knees, at least when one party controls one or more houses of the legislature and another party controls the presidency, which is not quite what we're experiencing at this immediate moment, though I think we will experience it again very soon. And the question might be, can our partisans compromise in as they have to, as the Constitution asks them to, in fact, insists that they do? That is, I think, the question. I'm going to turn back to it, but the first take on this question that I'd like to investigate is whether parties can repair the defects in our Constitution. One defect being, or partial defect being, that it's a nonpartisan Constitution. The fact that it's a nonpartisan Constitution presents a challenge, even a problem, to those who want to make the Constitution work. So let me first talk a little bit about the nonpartisan Constitution and describe it, remind you of what it means to say we have a nonpartisan Constitution. And Professor Fott, if somebody would, if you'd like to interrupt me with a question, please feel free. The parties, of course, the word parties appears nowhere in our Constitution, in contrast to more recent constitutions, say like the Constitution in Germany. If we were writing a constitution today, parties would probably be an entire chapter of the Constitution. But the word doesn't appear. And that's pretty amazing, because political scientists today and political scientists for the past 50 years have not been able to imagine how representative democracy can work without parties. The most sort of passionate and cogent statement of this came, more than 50 years ago by E.E. Schattschneider, the famous political scientist and scholar of parties. Modern democracy is impossible without parties, he wrote. And as we teach in Introduction to American Government, and as we have taught for several generations, parties perform a number of functions that are essential in the political system. They activate people, they mobilize people, they recruit candidates, they introduce issues. They, most of all, organize a legislature. And let me just rest on that one for a moment, because as Professor Fott mentioned, I serve in a legislature. I am therefore a partisan. I ran as a partisan. The word Democrat is next to my name on the ballot when I run, and I caucus with the Democrats in the legislature. And when I look out at our legislature, cannot imagine how it would work without parties. Any legislature is a large group of people. The New Hampshire legislature happens to have 400 people in it. It's almost as large as the United States Congress. And of course, in order for anything to get done in that legislature, imagine full attendance, perfect attendance, at least 201 people have to stand together and vote together. Very, very hard to get 201 people to stand behind anything. There are just so many reasons to disagree. There are so many problems to raise. Right now, I'm considering introducing a bill that it's a very, non-sexy bill. It would compel the Division of Motor Vehicles to open an office near where I live. It's something my constituents would really appreciate. And I've been trying to get co-sponsors and writing to other people. And it's incredibly difficult. The number of super thoughtful, unintended consequences that this bill could drive, the number of, the incredible problems having to do with ultra secure communication systems between the Department of Motor Vehicles office and the State House and so forth, I had never thought of. And I'm just discovering this in the course of trying to get a few other people, 4 or 5 is what I'd like, to co-sponsor it with me. I may not succeed at that. I may not succeed at getting my party to endorse it. And if I don't, the bill just can't go anywhere, because there won't be more than 10 or 15 of us who vote for it. So what a party does is it pulls people together and allows them, ideally, if you're in it, to form a group that's so large you get to pass bills. You're the majority. And that alone is really hard to do. It's going to be hard for me to find the other 200 people I need to pass this bill. It'd be impossible without my party, and it'd be impossible unless my party decides to help me. But here's the other problem. Suppose I succeed and I pass that bill. A day later, someone who doesn't want that to happen, maybe because they want division of motor vehicle resources for their part of the state, could introduce another bill and get 201 people to back it and overturn mine. Or they could come back in the next session and overturn mine. Once you pass something in a legislature that takes so much effort to get through, suppose you manage to get the governor to sign it or the president to sign it, it becomes a law. You want it to stay a law. You want it to stay a law at least long enough to find out whether it works. Suppose you pass something like Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. You don't want it to be repealed 2 years later or 6 years later because you want to give it enough time. And that means that the group that came together to pass the bill in one moment has to stay together over time and keep defending that bill. In fact, what a party really is in a legislature is a group of people who define themselves in terms of their commitment to a set of bills or a set of legislative purposes, laws, programs, policies. That's what a party is. A legislature won't function without some group that brings people together and holds them together over time. Call it whatever you want. I don't care. But that's where parties started in modern democracy. Modern democracy is representative democracy. Representative democracy has legislatures. In fact, the legislature is the beating heart of modern democracy. And once you have a legislature, you have an incredible incentive for the people in that legislature to form a group that brings people together, a group large enough to pass bills and then holds them together over time. Call it a party, call it whatever you want. And then that group to get reelected and to be a majority over a long period of time has to go to the voters and say, hey, vote for us, the blue team. Vote for us, the blue team. We're going to bring Division of Motor Vehicles offices near you, or we're going to get rid of the lines in those offices, or something like that. And so once there's this group in the legislature that stands together and it then begins to cultivate tethers in the citizenry, what political scientists call the electorate, you've got what looks like a party. A party in the electorate, a party in the legislature, maybe a party in government. So that's how parties come into being. That's why it's really hard for us to imagine democracy working without them. And that's what makes the fact that our Constitution is a nonpartisan Constitution, surprising and potentially problematic. And so let me just walk through for a moment, if you'll indulge me, how I think of the Constitution as being nonpartisan. It's not just nonpartisan because it doesn't use the word parties or make some official place for them. I don't think it really needs to do that necessarily. It's nonpartisan in a deeper way. It's nonpartisan in the respect that that a certain kind of interpretation of our institutions upholds the ideal of nonpartisanship. And that ideal comes to us from the institutions themselves and from what so many people think of as one of the most authoritative interpretations of the Constitution, the interpretation offered by two of the three most ardent nationalists in the Constitutional Convention, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Yes, I know Jay was also part of this interpretation. We call it the Federalist Papers. But it's really Hamilton and Madison. They wrote more of it, and they were really the great nationalists in the Constitutional Convention, along with James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who didn't happen to be part of the Federalist Paper effort. So the interpretation, the idea of a nonpartisan Constitution can be seen in the Federalist Papers, and in particular in the paper that every political scientist teaches in probably every introduction to American government, Federalist 10, the single paper that I think the discipline of American political science loves the most, and that every political science major, I think, still has to read, maybe even reads in high school before they get to university. Federalist 10 has this sort of famous warning that with democracy comes faction, and with faction comes a threat to liberty. Fundamental problem in democracy. A faction is any group, large or small, majority or minority, that's opposed to the rights of individuals and the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. That's a faction. It's a group, you could say, of shared interest, but a narrow interest, an interest that's not perfectly consistent, maybe even opposed to the permanent aggregate interests of the community, or in the worst case, opposed to the rights of individuals. Factions, Madison says, are natural. They will come up. They will come up every time, any place there's freedom. They'll exist wherever there's liberty, because like-minded people will come together and will agitate for, activate, we could say, to use a word we see in the Federalist, for what they believe in, what they need, what they want, even if those beliefs, needs, and wants are opposed to the interests of the whole or the rights of others. I think this is really why we in political science love, one of the reasons we like James Madison, notwithstanding his flaws. We like him because of this earthly characteristic. He doesn't think citizens in a democracy are going to be extra noble. He doesn't expect that they're going to be angelic. And he doesn't design the Constitution or defend the Constitution with that expectation in mind. He understands that what we would say selfish, he wouldn't say that, but that people are going to be maybe selfish, self-interested, or passionate, self-regarding. And we're not going to stop it. We're not going to stop it without extinguishing liberty, at any rate. So what to do about it? Well, he says, rather than stop factions, why not try to step in and prevent them from influencing legislation? How do we do that? He points to two things that might help prevent factions from becoming ruling groups that control legislation. The first one, of course, is representation. And he thinks that representation, a scheme of electing representation, indirect democracy, where the people don't directly rule, like they did in Greece, where they came together in the village green and the town center in the assembly, often on a daily basis, and could introduce legislation, motions, and pass them directly. That's real democracy. That's the people ruling. This democracy wouldn't be real democracy. It wouldn't be like those ancient democracies. It wouldn't be direct democracy. It would be constitutional democracy. And the first fact of constitutional democracy is that representatives stand between the people and the laws that are passed and imposed on the people. The people do not directly pass legislation. Again, I think people might think, well, representation was just a technological necessity. It was really hard in the early moments of national politics for people to get to one place. It'd be impossible for full-time farmers to gather that way. It took forever to get from Maine or Georgia to some central spot like Philadelphia or New York. So of course it was necessary, but that's certainly not true now. And that wasn't the fundamental reason why Madison advocated for representation. Madison wanted representation because he hoped that representatives would actually improve public views, that they wouldn't directly represent what people thought, felt, and wanted in government, but that they would refine and distill what people thought, felt, wanted, and speak their own minds. And what would equip representatives to do this, what would make it more likely that people would select broad-minded, independent representatives who could think for themselves, who are judicious and just. What would do that is the second feature that made factions, that would present an obstacle to factions and prevent them from ruling: large districts. Not just representation, but large districts. Here in the New Hampshire legislature, we do not have large districts. As I mentioned, we have 400 representatives, and we have a state of 1,200,000, 1,500,000. We have a state that's about the size and population of Austin, Texas. So we each technically could say represent 4,000 people, 4,000 people, basically a neighborhood. In fact, our constituencies are so small that they can't even operationalize them. So most of us are bundled into larger districts just because you can't have can't separate the vote in every sort of draw that many districts and separate the vote that many ways. So I represent two towns that together have about 15,000 people in them, and that's about the small. And four of us are representing those two towns together. But here's an interesting fact about the New Hampshire legislature. There's a constitutional right for every town over a certain threshold of population, I think it's right now about 4,000, to have at least one representative from it. Every town gets representative. And the way the New Hampshire Constitution conceives of things is that towns are these natural things. They come into being on their own. They're real. They're real places. I'm from Hanover. It means something when I go around the state and say that. I grew up in New Hampshire. I grew up in Manchester, which is a big town. And when I say that, it means something. People think something about me because Manchester is a mill town. It's a gritty mill town. So I grew up in Manchester. And they, oh, you grew up in Manchester. And if you grew up in Manchester or the mountains or the seacoast, it means something to people. Every town has its own flavor. Every town came into being for a particular kind of reason. Maybe there's a fall in the river and it created just enough power to put up a mill, and that's what brought a collection of people together. It became a town. Maybe there's wonderful flat land alongside a river, and town came together to raise sheep, and a certain kind of farming community grew up. Maybe it's a fishing community over by the seacoast. So every town has its own way of life and its own flavor, and every town gets its representation. In the national Constitution, the United States Constitution, the Constitution that is the subject of Constitution Day, representatives don't represent real places. Madison did not want them to represent real places. They're not meant to represent natural communities. They're meant to represent unnatural agglomerations, districts so large that no one way of life prevails and dominates the district, that no one interest distinguishes the district. So large, the people in it can't even really get to know each other. They have a hard time communicating. They can't really mobilize. If they share an interest, they can't even discover it. And if they share an interest and know it, they can't really do much about it to pressure representatives to respond to them because they can't coordinate their efforts over so great a space. John Oliver, years ago, I think on the Daily Show, and he's a correspondent for the Daily Show, used to do this little skit called "Know Your District," and he went to he tried to get to all 435 congressional districts and talk to the member of Congress about, tell me about the 18th district here in Illinois. The 18th district is a wonderful district, and he was kind of making fun of the fact that the 18th district wasn't a real place at all. And the only person who was loyal and identified with the 18th district was the member of Congress who represented it. And they're not natural communities. They're kind of fake things. There's no people in a district. There's no group sharing a way of life. There's just a bunch of persons who don't know each other, who can't easily communicate, as I said, who can't find each other, who can't act together, who can't act in concert, who can't mobilize. How do those people elect someone? Well, Madison hoped and thought that in these large districts, they'd have no choice but to elect what he called diffused and established characters. Phrase from Federalist 10. Diffused, meaning they're known. Their reputation is diffused. They're sort of, people know who they are. They've made a name for themselves, is the way I'd put it. Diffused and established. People have made a name for themselves. Maybe war heroes. Maybe really successful people in business, really successful farmers. Maybe people who are distinguished by their public service on a smaller scale in local government or state government. People who are looked up to. And there wouldn't be many of them in a big district. And so when there's an election, the people would kind of all gravitate to the most distinguished, the most valuable player from the district. And these outstanding and accomplished people wouldn't be ideologues. They wouldn't be movement leaders. They certainly wouldn't be hyper-partisans. Diffused and established characters would be what we call today elites. They'd be elites. So the Constitution is meant to establish a legislature dominated by elites. If you don't like the word elites, just keep calling them diffused and established characters, and I will know what you mean. We could think of a constitution in two broad ways. You can think of the Constitution as a kind of transmission. And what a transmission does, I'm a car repair person. What my transmission does when my car is working is it takes kinetic energy generated in the engine and it transmits it to the wheels. And you could say the Constitution is like that transmission. It takes the people's needs and wants and it converts them into authoritative laws that serve those needs and wants. That's what a Constitution does. Another way of thinking about a Constitution is that it's designed to actually impede, to create a kind of obstacle between the feelings, passions, loyalties, and interests of the people and the authoritative force of law, so that one does not get transmitted to the other directly. And it has to pass through a filter, the filter of the judgment that these elite representatives bring. The only thing that gets converted into law are what these elite representatives think is consistent with the interests of the whole and the rights of individuals. Maybe there are passions that people hold. Maybe they're activated by particular urgent passion at a given moment. But if that passion would incline them to something unjust, then good representatives would stand between them and law and prevent it from expressing itself, this popular passion from expressing itself in authoritative law. So in that respect, the Constitution is not a transmission. It's not something that facilitates popular rule. It's something that almost impedes it. It makes sure that laws don't violate rights, that laws aren't stupid, that laws accord with, to borrow another phrase from the Federalist, justice and sound judgment. Another way of thinking about it, another way of thinking about this ideal of our Constitution, an ideal that I see right there in Federalist 10, is that the Constitution obliterates rule, R-U-L-E, rule. So what's democracy? Democracy is where the people rule. Here, the people rule. The first question of politics, Politics 101, first question of politics, who rules? The one, the few, the many, the moneyed, the ordinary. Who rules? The point of our Constitution, the point of the nonpartisan Constitution, is to create a system not where the people rule, but where no one rules. So what do we get if we don't get rule? Well, Hamilton called it administration. In Federalist 27, I direct you to Federalist 27 if you want to see where he uses that. He uses the word all over the place, though, and it's the word that we should associate most with him and him with the most. Administration. We get an administration. In fact, that's what we call our presidency, our executive, the administration. I would call it governing. What we get is not rule, but government. And government, unlike rule, involves process. Ugh. Rule is, I think, for ambitious people, for people whose ambition even makes them a bit dangerous. Rule is attractive. Rule is delicious. Rule is where you get to impose your way on your surroundings. You don't get to suffer the inconvenience of coordinating your actions with other people when that's inconvenient, or even taking stock of their interests and needs. You just get to have your way. And as I said, there are many people so well formed, that's not what they want to do. They're super respectful all the time. And I admire that, but there are lots of people who are attracted to the prospect of getting what they want when they want it. That's rule. Governing doesn't really promise that kind of satisfaction. It's really not very satisfying. Who wants to be an administrator? If I wish we were in the room together, I could ask, who wants to be an administrator? Almost no one. It's just not very sexy. What do you want to be when you grow up? An administrator, if I could be. An academic administrator. Process is slow. Process is frustrating. Process is ineffective in many cases. So for instance, what we teach when we teach about how the people rule, we teach process, how a bill becomes a law. That's 8th grade civics. the process by which it happens. And even then, we really skip over most of the process because we just say the legislature, Congress passes, the House passes a bill. We don't really talk about what's involved. Does a House, a bill go to a committee, gets assigned to committees, maybe more than one committee. Committees have hearings. They have public testimony. They take votes. They write opinions. They write reports. They make recommendations to the whole. They bury bills. They table bills. They recommit bills. Bills can go into committees and never be seen from again. And that's why process is so frustrating. I'm on the election law committee in the New Hampshire legislature, and that's where I really do my work as a legislator. Yes, I go to the full sessions where I vote on all the bills that appear on the floor of the legislature, but the real work is in this committee. And that's where you really learn something. That's where you get testimony by experts. That's where you really investigate what the effect is of a bill. And I can't tell you how many times somebody sponsors a bill and it comes into a committee and they make a statement in favor of the bill. And then some experts or some people who would be very much impacted by the bill come in and explain why they're concerned about it. And oftentimes the sponsors themselves will say, let's keep talking about this. Let's study it a little bit more. Let's table it for now. I didn't realize it was going to have that effect. That's process. That's government. That's governing. Now, I think it's not very satisfying. It's very slow. It's kind of kludgy. It's kind of boring. And I think, there's a understandable desire by people to liberate themselves from the frustrations of governing, of administration, of an administrative government, and to locate some sort of more immediate way of translating their passions and their wants and their needs into laws. I think ungoverning is a very, very strong temptation, a standing temptation. It will always be there if you happen to have the kind of nonpartisan constitution that we have. So that's what I mean by a nonpartisan constitution. And what makes me want to ask, can partisans make this work? And the real reason I want to ask that isn't because in the first analysis, I think partisans are bad. I don't think they are bad necessarily. And as I mentioned, I am one. Actually, I think they make the Constitution work. They're the only thing that can make this thing work. The reason we need partisans to make it work is because the nonpartisan Constitution is unworkable. It's unworkable because it's deeply unattractive. The problem we have isn't in the first instance hyperpartisanship. Yes, that's a problem for us in 2021. In the first instance, the problem we have is the nonpartisan Constitution itself. And the basic problem? It's elitist by design. It's disconnected by design. It's potentially unresponsive by design. The people who saw these problems first were those who expressed doubts about the Constitution as soon as it was proposed. And of those people, we call them the anti-federalists. We just collect them under that title. But really, there are people who showed up in state ratifying conventions and expressed concerns. Some of them expressed concerns and later supported the Constitution after people like Madison compromised on a whole bunch of things, like a Bill of Rights. Some of them continued to oppose it. One of my favorite anti-federalists from the state of New York, like Hamilton, was Melancton Smith. And in the New York State ratifying convention, he defended an idea of representation as resemblance. He said, the idea naturally presents itself to our minds, meaning this is what we just ordinarily think when we speak about representation and representatives, is this, that representatives resemble those they represent. How about that for an idea? That the legislature should be a true picture of the people. That's what the New Hampshire legislature, 400 large, tries to be. That the legislature should possess the knowledge of the people's circumstances and their wants and sympathize with them in their distresses and be disposed to seek their true interests. And the problem with this Constitution and this legislature that it would create, the Congress and the Senate, is that The representatives, Melancton Smith said, will generally be composed of the first class in the community, by which he meant the upper class. It's going to be composed of the upper class. He said, I know a lot of you are going to tell me, oh, we don't have classes here. This is America. That's a crazy idea. We don't have legal or hereditary distinctions. We don't have a nobility. What do you mean upper class? Melancton Smith said, listen, there are real differences. Every society, he said, naturally divides itself into classes. The author of nature has bestowed on some greater capacities than on others. Birth, education, talents, wealth create distinctions among men as visible and as of much influence as the distinctions that defined a hereditary aristocracy. This government will be in the hands of the upper class. Men, he said, in the middling class, who are qualified to be representatives, will not be so anxious to be chosen. They'll have other things to do, like work for a living. And if they do run, they won't be chosen because it'll be hard for them to form a campaign. It'll be hard for them to attract attention. It'll be hard for them to get their names out. A sturdy yeoman, an ordinary farmer, will almost never be selected to serve. And a government that's dominated by the upper class won't understand the community sufficiently well to pass good laws that serve it effectively, and will lose the confidence of the people, and will lose the affection of the people. And a government that the people don't have confidence in is not a government that can last. Now, these days, look at the trust in government numbers. People do not have confidence in their government. Melancton Smith said this could be a serious crisis for this kind of concept. That lack of confidence could be a serious crisis for this kind of constitution. And I think it is. It's a source of profound fragility. If our Constitution doesn't last long into the future, and God, I hope it does, it will be, I think, because of this defect. So Melancton Smith and his allies, who expressed concerns about the Constitution back in 1788, they were onto something. And that's the problem. And one solution, and we're going to need more than one, but one solution for this are parties and partisans. Parties can do for the Constitution what it cannot do for itself so easily, which is connect it to the people, connect it to a base, connect it to a group. People may not be attached to the House, but they'll be attached to the party that they identify with, and maybe to their representative, especially if they're representatives from their party. So they connect people, and here's the biggest thing. Parties actually give the people a chance to rule, but to rule in a way that's consistent with the broad purpose of the Constitution, which is to rule in a way consistent with the permanent and aggregate interests of the community and respect for the rights of others. Now, how do parties do that? How do parties help the people rule in a constitution that's sort of obliterating the very idea of rule and replacing it with governmental administration and process? They do it in this way. It's very simple. Parties create the possibility that our executive and our legislature could be kind of fused, like they are in a parliamentary system. They could be linked through a party. If you're a partisan, say kind of like I am, you have ideas about this law I want to pass to get a motor vehicle office in my town or in the close by. Well, I'm going to be able to do that and lots of other things I care about if my party wins a majority. And it's going to need a majority not just in the House where I serve, but also in the Senate where I don't serve. And we're going to need to elect a governor too. So we're always thinking about how to build a coalition large enough to win everything. to win the House, Senate, and the governorship. And when we do, if that coalition is large enough, and if we stand together reliably enough, once we do win, we can actually legislate. We can pretty well rule. This is the goal. This ought to be the goal of just let's call it a self-interested or ambitious partisan, or partisan with a purpose, a partisan that wants to get something done. You're running for Congress. You don't just want to win and serve in the minority. I think it'd be moderately satisfying to do that. I'm in the minority now. It's very frustrating. It's a little bit more satisfying for a senator because they have a little bit more discretion, a little bit more power than members of Congress do. But boy, they want to be in the majority. They really want, that's what they want. They want their party to win the majority in the House and the Senate and in the Electoral College. And that's the great goal. And in order to do that, and I mean, this is almost just so elemental, I hesitate to say it. It's so silly and basic. It did take me about 15 years to figure out. But to do that, they have to hit this very, very high bar to win everything, to win the table. They have to, get a majority of 435 equally populated districts around the country. They have to have a majority of spatially, geographically dispersed, very unequally populated things we call states. I can't believe there are 2 Dakotas. And they have to mash those 2 things together and get a majority, get 270, whatever it is, 538 electoral votes in the Electoral College. And to do that, their majority can't be just like an evanescent, one moment in time majority. It can't just be like the Gallup poll. We got 50% plus 1 this morning. You need a lot more than that to win it all. You need a sort of a super majority. You probably need 53, 54%. The majority can't just be that. It also has to be dispersed all over the country. You need it in a bunch of different states. And it has to last. It has to be durable. It has to hold itself together over time. Because it's, for instance, like the whole government isn't elected all at once by Madison's design. Only a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. So you don't even get a crack at the majority in a Senate until you wait 4 years. And that's only 66% you get to vote for in every 4-year window. To vote before 100 seats come up, you have to wait 6 years. So that majority that you formed today, this morning, the blue party, the red party, it has to hold itself. It has to be really large, spatially dispersed, and durable. And a majority like that is just less likely to be a faction. Very unlikely to be a faction. It's going to have so many different groups in it that compromise with each other, that often just can't stand each other. That it's a coalition. It's not a faction. It's a broad coalition. It's as we used to call our parties, a catch-all coalition. Like, you want to join? Come. We'll figure out how to do something for you. We're not going to give you everything you want, but we'll do something for you. Join us. Come on in. We need you. And that's the way. That's what the Constitution tells partisans to do. It invites them to do that. It speaks to it attaches itself to their ambition, both their programmatic, public-spirited ambition. They want to get something good done, and they're just individual ambition. They want to make a name for themselves and have power and rule. And in order to do that, you got to be in the majority, not just in your little part of the thing, but in the whole thing. You got to run the whole thing. And to be that, you got to be in a big, big, broad, diverse, cacophonous coalition that holds itself together over time. This is what I think Jefferson's party did for the Constitution after the election of 1800. We call that the air of good feelings, like there weren't any parties. There was a party, and it created a coalition that ran everything. It ran the Federalists right out of business. It was so good. And for 25 years, Jefferson's party made that Constitution work. It's definitely what FDR's party did. FDR's amazing coalition of Northern laborers and Southern working class whites who opposed civil rights for blacks. That coalition lasted from 32 to at least 68. You might even date it. I mean, in a sense, it ran all the way to 1994 when the Democrats in the House finally lost their majority. It made the Constitution work. whether you like those parties or not. They did the job. They made the Constitution work. And what I've noticed is that our parties, and here I really mean the Democratic and the Republican parties, the great parties of the United States of America, some of the oldest democratic institutions in the world, that they are not just ideological, they're not just polarized. They're also just unable to form a durable governing majority. Neither party really in my lifetime, and I'm no longer someone that people refer to as young. Neither party in my lifetime has been able to make the Constitution work in the way that Jefferson and FDR did. Neither party's been able to win the House, the Senate, the presidency, and keep winning it for just a period of time. Let's say 12 years. It doesn't need to be 30 years. Just a good run. 16 years. And I mean, the House keeps flipping back and forth in this amazing way. The control of it, and what's really notable about our parties isn't just that they're ideological and polarized. It's really that is super lamentable, super problematic. Happy to talk about it, but what I find really remarkable is that they are absolutely even. They are just splitting the country right in half. They're absolutely even. And it's really weird for polarized parties to be even. I'd expect parties that collide in the middle and are almost like each other, just like mirror images of each other. They might, be absolutely even. That's what Anthony Downs predicted about parties. But our parties are very different and still incredibly they are deadlocked. They're deadlocked. One of the things that we've been seeing on the Election Law Committee here in New Hampshire are bills that, let me just put it generously, scrutinize the qualifications of a number of different voters, such as students. Some might say that they're aiming to disenfranchise, but I'll just leave the partisan talk to the side for tonight. It's Constitution Day. So let's just say they're scrutinizing the qualifications of these voters. Why? Well, one reason is that, our elections are being decided by an incredibly small number of votes. Right now, the United States Senate is divided 50-50. The only reason the Democrats run it is because the vice president is a Democrat. The junior senator from New Hampshire, Senator Maggie Hassan, who was elected in 2016, won her seat by a margin of 1,000 and I think 17 votes, if I'm remembering correctly. It's a small state, but we still had 800,000 people voting. 1,000 votes. And so parties are thinking, how do we get that margin of 1,000 votes? Could we keep those 1,000 people at home? Do they really have the qualifications to vote? Should they be at our polls? Are they students whose parents live out of state? Or are they the type of people who should really be qualified to vote here? We can get 1,000 people who voted for Maggie Hassan not to vote for her, not to be eligible to vote in New Hampshire. We're going to win. And so our parties, one, the other, are focused on these very, very small margins. And they're focused on what it will take to win by a hair's width, what it will take to have the right Secretary of State in place, to call the election for one party after the election is decided by a razor-thin margin. And in all that, what I think our parties are overlooking is the real goal, which is to make the Constitution work, to create a really large coalition that doesn't have to care about that 1,000-vote margin because it's winning by 5 or 10%. A coalition that's large, that's diverse, that's dispersed, that's intelligent, that's respectful, that stands together, that rules as the Constitution allows us to rule, in a way that's deliberative, that's prudent, and that's just. That's what our partisans need to be thinking about. And if they were more ambitious, not less ambitious, I think this is how they'd be thinking. That's what we need from our partisans. That's what we need. If they're going to make this Constitution work, if there are any students here and that's what we need from your generation of political leaders. We need leaders who not bring the country together. That's too much. You're not going to bring the whole country together and hold together as one unified group. Just bring a party together that's big and diverse, spread out over space, and that lasts over time. And I trust that if you can do that, it'll be a party that's also, I might not agree with it. I might be in the minority, but I trust that it'll be a party. If our Constitution, if our nonpartisan Constitution works, it'll be a party that's intelligent and respectful, that's prudent and effective, and that will make this Constitution last well into the future. With that, let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a provocative examination of the Constitution, Professor Muirhead. Let me invite our audience to ask questions again through the chat feature. Type your question right into to the chat. You can direct it to everyone, or you can direct it to me, and I will relay it to Professor Muirhead. So feel free to
and one
ask.
of the things I'm really interested in is why the parties are so even. If anyone has any suggestions about that, I'd be so interested to hear. I mean, it's not a question I know how to answer. I wish I could have used this talk to answer that.
All right, here's a question. Is it difficult to construct a successful party because the country is too factional, filled with too many differences, or are we too much alike?
Wow. Huh. That's so interesting. So that's a very provocative question, especially the idea that we might be too much alike to create a successful party. Yeah, I mean, I think on the factional question, the real problem is that the activated section of the population is very factional, very ideological. So, what I have to think about if I want to get reelected is, most of all, I have to think about the primary, and the people who voted. And so my primary could be in the middle of August, or it might be in early September. It won't be a voting day like that everyone talks about in the country, that's broadcast on television and so forth. So an awful lot of people won't even know that it happens. And turnout in a primary can be very low, 10, 15, 20%. And here's another feature about primaries. I'll be in a primary. I was in a contested primary running against other Democrats, just by definition. We all, like you say, agreed about a bunch of things. So it was very hard to differentiate us. I would be in these candidate fora, or backs and forth, questions and answers, town halls, I guess. And I couldn't decide. I got to vote for some other people too. I couldn't figure out who I'd support. I liked, a whole lot of them, and it was hard for me to figure out the differences. I really couldn't figure it out. So it's hard to vote in a primary. You have to attach a great deal of importance to very, very small differences. And the people who do that tend to be more on the extreme. And so extremists have this incredibly amplified influence in our system because of primary elections. And what's interesting to me is that these various efforts to kind of detoxify primaries, like the top two system in Oregon, Washington, and in California, doesn't seem to have made a difference. So anyway, that's the too factional shows up there. And our nomination systems might be the issue, filled with too many differences. I mean, that's where the factions rule, or in the nomination system. And are we too much alike? I mean, that's interesting too. That might be like, maybe the general electorate is so similar. I mean, this is what Mo Fiorina argues, that there basically is a kind of large centrist group in the broad electorate, especially the electorate that doesn't follow politics, for a living or as a daily hobby. And it could be that political entrepreneurs, candidates, and parties, end up having, because they have to give you a reason, to vote for them and not the other person. And to do that, they have to create and amplify maybe false differences, and and especially create feelings of antipathy. So this is the way that partisans may be, creating this kind of affective or hateful partisanship. And maybe the problem, the underlying reason they have to do that is that they're dealing with an electorate that doesn't disagree with each other enough. So they really have to activate it, make it hateful. Great question. And I'm open. I'm really open. I love that thought, though, that we might be too much alike.
Okay. Once again, let me remind you, please feel free to type in questions to the chat feature. Here's another question that begins, I'm curious about what you think of the two-party system. I find the historical stability of this system to be especially impressive. We've never really had a stable three-party system in the United States. Do you see a possible near future in the United States with three roughly equal or at least balanced parties?
Yeah, wouldn't that be interesting? And you could, I think, even in a winner-take-all district, you might still expect to get 2.5 parties, some sort of third party that might not be equal to the other two, but at least is consistent, like happens in the UK. And you're right, we don't really have that. Part of that, I think, is ballot access. We do have a Libertarian Party. It gets access to the ballot all over the country, and because there is a party, and the people in the party know how to get names on the ballots. They don't have to fight for that every election in every district around the country. So that's there, but it doesn't seem to. Isn't it interesting that no one's used that? No one's harnessed that structure. I don't want to call it a shell, but that organization, and created something out of it in the way that so many Europeans have kind of created something out of green parties that's much, much bigger than just single issue environment parties. And so it does seem like there ought to be some room for entrepreneurial action. But gosh, I mean, I have a colleague, Charlie Whelan, who tried to start a centrist party, and he had allies like Michael Bloomberg. They had money. They had some candidates who were willing to win. They had a platform. They had an argument about why they were appealing to the centrist electorate, and they just couldn't get that thing off the ground. That plane got stuck on the runway and had to taxi back to the gate for a long bout of maintenance. And so anyway, it's interesting. You're right. I think it's not just a story about the two-party duopoly preventing other parties from getting on the ballot, because that's not quite true. And it's also not even the way that they, that those brands sort of take up the best real estate on the ballot. Because I think in the top two primary, like in Washington State, every candidate can list anything next to their names. I think they have 16 letters that they can use next to their names, something like that. They could write Democrat, they could write Republican, they could write, Republic, Democrat. They could abbreviate the two, mash them together. They can write any word they want, and they don't need the group itself to approve of them identifying with a party or running under its label. They could write green, and so you'd expect, I think, in California, Washington, places with the top two, you'd expect political entrepreneurs to try to create maybe a new brand that's not saddled by the negative connotations of the existing ones. So it's a harder question now than it might have used to have been to answer that. And I'm sorry I can't, Mr. Hay, give you a really good answer to that.
Here's a question that's in line with something I was thinking myself. I wanted to ask you about what's called the administrative state. And here's a questioner who says, Steve Bannon infamously stated that he wanted to deconstruct the administrative state. Would it be at all fruitful to put this sentiment into dialogue with Hamilton's concept of the administration in Federalist 27?
I think that's a great idea. I think that's a terrific idea. I mean, the first thing we'd need to do is to contrast or just kind of compare what Hamilton meant by administration with what we might mean today, what a law professor might mean today about the administrative state. And so when law professor, I mean, that the term the administrative state refers to.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's give a brief explanation of what that
Yeah,
is
so
taken to
it
mean.
refers to the executive branch, and in particular, the rulemaking power in the agencies. And this is a highly controversial power that some say has involved a delegation from Congress that's inconsistent with the Constitution. So, I mean, I think that, there's been an argument really since the New Deal that the growth of a certain kind of administrative state has imported the legislative function into the executive branch in a way that violates the separation of powers. And there's been a certain kind of opposition to or skepticism about the administrative state, ever since the beginning of the New Deal, and certainly since its more, aggressive development many years after the New Deal. So that's one thing people are talking about, I think, when they say deconstruct the administrative state. They're looking over at the agencies of the executive branch that are writing rules that have the force of law, but who aren't legislators. I actually think, though, that there's a likeness between that administrative state and the technical legal questions about the charge of power, the grant of power that authorizes them. There's a likeness between that and Hamilton's use of the term administration. They're not completely disconnected. Hamilton wrote about the presidency in the Federalist Papers. He didn't write about the legislature so much. And he wanted a very powerful president, infinitely renewable for re-election. He did not want a term limits on the president. And he wanted a president who could undertake grand plans and great schemes, something like building a great navy that could, ideally create a country so powerful that it could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great European monarchies. And he knew that was not going to happen, probably in his lifetime, but he was anticipating it. And so I think, he certainly wasn't anticipating the administrative state that develops in the 20th century, but he's anticipating something like it. And Hamilton was charged with being a monarchist. And that's in part because of a speech he gave in the Constitutional Convention praising monarchy on June 18th, 1787. He did like monarchy, but he wanted, and he wanted an elected monarch. And so I think, Bannon's suspicion of the administrative state, Bannon is, he's a certain kind of pugilistic, provocateur. But let's just say there will be very intelligent statements of skepticism and opposition to the administrative state that aren't quite as insouciant or destructive as, say, Steve Bannon's rhetoric is, that really suspect it has betrayed democracy, again, by creating an overly powerful executive branch. And that's exactly the kind of thing that's the charge that Hamilton was vulnerable to as well. And it's really, the problem with that rulemaking, agency is that it doesn't have good tethers into the population. It doesn't have connections to the passions and loyalties of the people. And ideally, it's making good rules and it serves the interests of people. That's what Hamilton hoped. But without, popular support, the entire government can, I think, become much more fragile. And that's one of the things that fuels, I think, a certain kind of populist fervor in American politics.
Your thesis is that the Constitution works if there is a large coalition that is able to govern and to enact policies. I wonder whether but when you notice all of the points of influence that the Constitution set up, in the presidency, in the House, in the Senate, I wonder whether you might not say that the Constitution could work even without one party controlling all three organs, that it's more responsive if, say, the 60% or 55% coalition doesn't get everything it wants, but the government has to slow down and listen to the 45% and maybe give it some say in what's happening. Is the problem that there's not one party in control of everything, or is the problem that that the notion of cooperation has become a bad word. That to be partisan means not to cooperate. Maybe mixed government, divided government could work if if the meaning of partisanship was better understood.
Yeah. So I think, divided government certainly can work. So there are two ways of making the Constitution work. One where one party controls everything. Now, your worry there is that there'll be some large group that gets its way and won't be checked and will certainly overreach and be imprudent and insufficiently deliberative. Who knows? Maybe they'll decide to launch a ground invasion of Afghanistan or something like that. They undertake great projects that don't deliver us to great success, let's say. And there won't be enough of a countervailing power to check it and force it to really think through, maybe abandon some of its bad plans. There could even be, I don't think a group that's quite as geographically dispersed and lasting over time is going to be a tyrannical majority, but it could be, depending on how interests are distributed in the population. You might even get a certain degree of majority tyranny with a group like that. So there are certain grave worries about the image I've created, I've endorsed, where one party really creates a grand governing, durable governing coalition. There's ways to make divided government work. David Mayhew, when I was a graduate student, published just such a cool book, Divided We Govern, where the neatest thing about the book was that he collected every piece of really important legislation passed at the national level, I think from 45 to 1990. And he showed that, every one of these pieces, almost every piece of legislation was passed by great bipartisan majorities. And bipartisanship was the way that the legislature really worked when it legislated on big things. And there were strong incentives for the majority party to try to get the minority party to sign on. And there were incentives for the minority party too to do that. And what's so interesting is that, that picture of American politics that I found so impressive when I was in graduate school, by the time of Obama's president, has that no longer characterizes how important legislation is passed. And by the time Obama's president, if he can get one or two Republicans to vote for the Affordable Care Act, it gets coded as bipartisan. When Mayhew was writing it, you needed more than one or two people from the other party to call something, bipartisan. So divided government did work, and then it stopped working. And we got these sort of, like the debt showdowns where the two parties couldn't come together even around a debt limit crisis, and the credit rating of the country, was notched down in that moment during the Obama presidency, and I think ever since probably 2008, it seemed just impossible for the parties at the national level to reliably work together, and so why? And I think what Frances Lee, political scientist at Princeton, in her book, I think it's called Insecure Majorities, argues is that the parties are too even. When the parties are super duper even, there's no incentive to cooperate. Because if you're in the minority, you think to yourself, we're in the minority now, but we're not going to be in the minority for long. We're not necessarily going to be in the minority after the next election. So do not cooperate with the majority party. Don't cooperate with the majority party, the Republican minority said during the Obama administration on immigration reform. Do not do it, because we'll just give this Democratic president and the Democrats in general a real achievement to run on. And we don't want to give them anything to run on. Our number one priority, said the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, is to defeat the Democratic president, Barack Obama. That's our number one priority. It's not legislation at all. And I think if the probability of taking the presidency in 2012 was ranked much lower, if the Republicans were in there like, we're stuck with the Democratic president for 8 years, we can't pass anything unless we get the Democratic president's signature on some stuff. We can't do anything we want to do or protect the interests we really care about at all unless we are influential in legislation. And we're stuck with this president for 8 years. So we better work with him somehow. We can pretend we're not working with him. We can beat him up when we go home and campaign, but we better figure out how to work with him. And if we give a little on this, will he give a little on that? And can we get a little bit of a revision in this bill so that, this thing we care about is taken care of? Because it's going to be a long wait before we get the White House. So again, if you think you can win in the next election, you have very, very little incentive to cooperate. And the Republicans, when the New Deal dominated, when the Democrats dominated the legislature, they weren't anticipating they would control Congress. They win in 1994, if I'm remembering correctly, 2 years into the Obama presidency. They had the Congress for a little while, was it under Eisenhower, but basically they didn't have it at all by the time of Roosevelt. And Mayhew writes in 1990, so he's looking at a system where the Republicans, to be effective, had to work with the Democrats, and the Democrats, to pass stuff, needed the fig leaf, needed to say that they were being bipartisan and not being extreme and one-sided and not being like a tyrannical majority. So important legislation got hammered out in this bipartisan way. Now, where we think we can win each side, that's not happening. I just got an email. Sorry for carrying on so long. I just got an email from the party in the New Hampshire legislature, some of the, not the elected leadership, but some of the people who work, staffers who work in the party. I don't know, maybe it was from a fellow member. And they said, hey, don't introduce that bill now. Wait, we're 1 year away from the next election. We're going to be in the majority in 1 year. Let's put that bill in when we're in the majority, because if we put it in now, we're going to have to compromise on so many different things to get it passed. There's not really going to be what we want. So hold back on that bill. And that's how the logic of getting elected in a system where, and by the way, like in the New Hampshire, if you look at the New Hampshire House, we're flipping back and forth, even more than the national House. It's just happening. We're really churning. And so each of us, the Democrats and Republicans, think that they're going to win the majority the next time around. And that's creating an incentive for some really, really bad behavior.
All right, here's a question that takes us back a ways. To what extent, if at all, do you think that what the founding fathers called diffused and established characters, or what we today call the elite, were influenced by Plato's Republic?
Oh, cool. I mean, the really interesting thing about Plato's Republic is first that educated people in this society have been reading it in every generation since the Moors brought it, out of hiding, as it were, and so it's part of the culture. I don't know if all the founders literally read Plato, but some would have, and all would have been familiar with the idea. And the really cool thing about the Republic is that it works out an idea that has a certain kind of logic in our souls, that it would be good to be ruled by truly, truly wise people who are also truly disinterested, and it also diagnoses a certain kind of tragedy that accompanies power wherever it's collected, wherever it's found, which is that those who want it most are at least deserve it. And those who are best able, because of their virtue, to exercise it well, have the least interest in it. And I think that's just true. Years and years ago, like when I was an undergraduate, there was a bank that recruited students to come work for it. And it was a really obnoxious bank that developed a national reputation for being really obnoxious and then went out of business. And the question in the interview was, what turns you on, money, sex, or power? And actually they got kicked off campus for asking this obnoxious question. But I mean, if you have an answer to that question, you were kind of insufficiently virtuous enough to work for that bank. And what about those who just they look at power like, I don't want to boss people around. I don't want to impose my way on other people. That sounds like a lot of trouble. I'd kind of like to be left alone. I'd like to read. I'd like to sing. I'd like to think. I'd like to do my vocation, and mind my own business and tend my own garden. I just don't. There's nothing in it. I'm not an alpha and I'm not a beta. I'm not in the power game. I'm not out there with the dogs trying to figure out who's alpha. I don't want it. I'm not in the dog park. And that type, isn't going to join the fray. Running for office is, I think one of the beautiful things about it actually is that it's humiliating. And what I found when I was campaigning is that there's a kind of ritual of humiliation that you have to go through. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but, stood on street corners with a sign with my name on it as cars, whiz by, just breathing in the exhaust. And I'd tell my family, so, I'm going to be late. I'm not going to be home for dinner. I'm going to go stand on the street corner with my sign. And, how many people are you persuading to vote for you? Probably none. It's a kind of, you stand out there and you realize you don't matter. Nobody really cares about you. Nobody really likes you that much. You're not that important. You come home feeling pretty unimportant. And I think even sitting incumbent senators, when they go campaign, are reminded just how obscure and unimportant and they are, and how undesirable their company is for so many. So this is a disagreeable thing, not to mention the business of raising money and that kind of thing. Who would do that except the people who have some desire for the power you get when you do it? And if you're someone who wants power, so this is Plato. It's in the logic of that is in our souls. It's you don't need to read Plato, and the yearning for an elite, for and not like a socioeconomic elite, but a soul elite, a virtuous elite, a public spirited, decent people. The yearning to be ruled, if you are ruled by people like that, is just natural. So Plato works out that logic, and you don't need to read Plato, I think, to feel the logic. And the founders, Madison, looked at these state legislatures. He looked at Rhode Island, which was debasing its currency. That it was forgiving debts. He looked at even John Hancock in Massachusetts. He saw demagoguery. He saw what he called the vicious arts of electioneering being practiced all over. And he saw these people getting elected to state legislatures who just weren't very admirable. Just like people say today, they look at Congress and does that really fill the people we look up to? There's a couple maybe, and Madison saw that too. And I think he just knew that the long-term interests of this republic would not be safeguarded unless somehow the decision-making party power was insulated a little bit from the passions and interests that were fueling and roiling state politics. And it wouldn't last unless some little bit of independence was institutionally built in for representatives, like the independence of a 6-year term for the Senate. I think he describes this in the Federalist. He gives us a certain image of the Constitution at work, and maybe the image, it's the ideal. But I think he knew very well that it wasn't going to operate according to that ideal on a daily basis. But sometimes when you're lying in the gutter, you want to look up at the stars, and you need to know what the ideal is that we should reach for, and that's, I think, what Madison's doing in part in this description.
Well, to the extent that the problem lies not in our stars but in ourselves, in the people ourselves, would you say that the bigger problem is that there are too many even insanely zealous partisans, or is the bigger problem that too many people are, as Tocqueville described, individualistic, that is, withdrawn, gripped by individualism, withdrawn into their small circles of family and friends, and about as apolitical as circumstances will let them be?
Yeah, that's really, thank you. So well put, that question. So I don't think that we're suffering from the kind of excessive individualism that Tocqueville describes, the privatism. I think there's a kind of a healthy apolitical life that a lot of people live. They're interested, if they rank their top 10 interests, politics wouldn't be on the list. I think that's okay. There's no reason why every citizen should be involved. Just sort of like following Major League Baseball. My son reads about it every single morning at breakfast. He's a real expert, but everyone isn't going to be that kind of assiduous fan of Major League Baseball, know all the players, all the trades, what the score is in the game in the fourth inning. So I don't think we need to be that political in that way to overcome our privatism. I think what we need to do is develop a kind of what Tocqueville called enlightened self-interest, a self-interest that can attach to the interests of others around us, so that we don't conceive of ourselves and our own interests in a really disconnected way. And that learning about how to enlarge your sense of self-interest happens through social life, through a social life in which we're connected to other people. And Tocqueville's view, it could happen through like New England local government, participating in local government. But it happens, first of all, through knowing other people. For a lot of people, it might happen by serving on their condo board, by serving, in a group and participating. It might be anything from, whatever, Girl Scouts to the Sierra Club, to a neighborhood group or a softball league. And when you're in those sorts of things, you have to learn how to coordinate with other people, and you learn a little bit about what they're like and what they do and what they care about, and you enlarge your sense of your own interest, and you bring them into your circle and into your consciousness. And I think that actually, contrary to Bob Putnam, I think that's actually happening pretty well. But what does short circuit it is ideology and ideological partisanship. And so when you're sitting alone at home, looking, on your phone at Facebook, and you're exposed to a stream of information that is very agitating, very roiling, and just a series of stories about how the other side is behaving irrationally, unjustly, dangerously. And there'll be some story about some group in some state 1,500 miles away. And it stirs these sorts of passions, these passions of enmity and passions of alarm and passions of fear. And there's no location to put those passions into action, except to kind of mentally affiliate with the group, the conservatives, the this, the that, and to hate the other side. And your participation comes in the form of, clicking on things, signing things, sending money, but not actually doing anything. And I think that really undercuts people's sense of enlarged self-interest, and it undercuts their practical judgment. I actually find it something that goes on just in my own professional life. I get a stream of emails from the administration at my university. I find many of them inane and somewhat infuriating. And then I'll get a bunch of emails from like-minded faculty. Can you believe this thing that's happening in the university? And I get really fired up, like, and there's nowhere to bring it. And I'm just reading my screen. I was like, my blood pressure goes up. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm not doing anything. And when I actually pick up the phone and call somebody in the administration and say, hey, I'm really worried about such and such a thing, suddenly I learned about all the different angles of it. And the process by which the decision was made. I'm like, there's a lot more to this than I thought. And I calmed down. I realized that I was being rash. And I think that digital communication is disconnecting us from action. And when it does that, and when it simultaneously fires up our passions and disconnects us from action, it undercuts our practical judgment. And that's what I'm worried about. That's what I think is kind of fueling a lot of affective or negative partisanship, or the partisanship in which hating the other side matters more than, commitment to the goals that define your own side. And anyway, so we really need to be out at the pub, out at the bar, out at the coffee shop, out at the club, out at the diner, out with each other, talking to each other a little bit, just to actually encounter people who don't think just like us. And and take each other in a little bit in everyday life.
Well, I hope what you say about digital communication does not apply
to a really boring lecture.
No, I know it's not that. I just hope that that you're not undercutting our practical judgment, and that I'm not doing the same thing in what we're saying. I would like to think we're not. At any rate, we've had some good questions from the audience, and I think we'll leave it at that for today. Unless do you have any closing remarks that you would like to make?
Well, I really think, just to finish, that the predicament we're in right now, again, to underline this, is that the two parties are so even in their support. And this is more evident in some states than others, but it's certainly evident when you aggregate across the whole country. And there are, from Georgia to New Hampshire, a lot of states that are like this individually. And again, I think that is creating incentives for people in the parties to behave in ways that are very damaging to constitutional democracy. And I, there was a hope by people like Madison, by kind of earthly political scientists, that we could design a system that depended only on ambition and self-interested incentives to work. That might be an exaggerated description of Madison's aim, but I think we're at a moment now where we're going to require virtue, not just the virtue of disinterestedness and public spiritedness, but the virtue of understanding. We need citizens who understand where we are in this moment. And so in that respect, I think that I hope I've helped. I really appreciate this ritual of Constitution Day. I think it helps. And I am so grateful to all of you who were so generous as to join us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. And once again, thanks to the Jack Miller Center for making this event possible. Thank you all for attending. And Professor Muirhead, we look forward to hearing from you in future publications, since we're not New Hampshireites and may not be hearing from you politically speaking.
That's very kind of you, and I hope you can hear from me in Las Vegas sometime.
we would like that very much. Yes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.